lot about them, or we can if we want to. There were two directors of the oil for food program, supposedly the humanitarian part of the sanctions. Both of them resigned because they regarded the sanctions as genocidal, carrying out a huge massacre of the population. The Clinton administration would not permit them to transmit their information to the Security Council, which was technically responsible. And the media agree. The spokesman for the State Department, James Burns, said that, referred to Hans von Sponeck, the second of them, as, he said, this man in Baghdad is paid to work, not to talk. And the press agrees and scholarship agrees, so they're suppressed. They knew more about Iraq than any other Westerner. They had hundreds of observers running around the country sending back reports. But you can do a Google search and find out how often they were allowed to speak in the United States in the run-up to the war, for that matter, since. Von Sponeck, who's a very distinguished international diplomat, wrote a book about it about 2 years ago called A Different Kind of War. I don't think there's a reference to it in the United States, let alone a review. We do not want to publicize our genocidal actions. But people in the Middle East noticed and didn't like it, and that increased the campaign of hatred among the moneyed Muslims, our friends there. Don't have to think about the others. But it doesn't matter what they think. The same is true of the invasion of Iraq. Iraqis regard it as worse than the Mongol invasions. It's the great successes. Iraq may never recover. I mean, the great success story of Petraeus is to establish warlord armies, which will probably tear the country up in the future, and also to turn, say, Baghdad. It's true the violence in Baghdad has declined, partly because there are fewer people to kill. There's been massive ethnic cleansing, and that's been accelerated by the Petraeus strategy of building essentially walled communities. It's a comment by Nir Rosen, who's one of the 2 or 3 journalists who actually reports seriously from Iraq. He speaks Arabic fluently, and he looks Arab, so he can get around easily. He travels all over, not with armed guards and Abrams tanks and so on. He says, talking about Baghdad recently, he says, looming over the homes in the district he's looking at are 12-foot-high walls built by the Americans to confine people to their own neighborhood, emptied and destroyed by civil war, which the U.S. fomented, walled off by the surge. Sections of the city feel more like a desolate, post-apocalyptic maze of concrete tunnels than a living, inhabited neighborhood. They're controlled by separation walls and, in fact, by the increasing use of air power, but a little quieter, so therefore the critics, having no principled criticism, don't talk about it much. Well, what does the public think about all these things? Well, we know about Iraq. The public wants to get out, but they're irrelevant. What about Iran? The next major crisis looming, which will make Iraq look like a tea party if they go through with it. There are opinions about this. There's the opinion of American elites, which you can read, say, in the New York Times or Washington Post or liberal journals and so on. They'll tell you that Iran is defying the world by enriching uranium. Well, exactly who is the world? Okay, well, we can find out. There is an organization called G77, 130 countries, includes the vast majority of the people of the world. They vigorously support Iran's right to all the rights guaranteed by the Non-Proliferation Treaty, including enriching uranium for nuclear power. So they're not part of the world, okay? Now, what about the American population? An overwhelming majority of the American population agrees with G77, namely that Iran should have the right to produce nuclear energy, but not nuclear weapons. So the American population is not part of the world. So non-aligned countries are not part of the world. American population is not part of the world. Obviously, Iranians are not part of the world. So who's left? Well, the world consists of people who follow Washington's orders. You can't say it includes the United States, because the overwhelming majority of Americans are not part of the world. They oppose this, just as on many other issues. And that goes on without comment. correctly if we're cheerleaders for the home team, and that's the framework for discussion. Is there a solution to the crisis with Iran, which is extremely serious? If the U.S. goes through with its plans, apparent plans, like I said, it might make Iraq look like a tea party. Well, there are solutions, potential solutions. One of them is what I just said, that Iran should have the rights of any signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel, Pakistan, and India also ought to have those rights if they sign the treaty. Since they haven't done it, they don't have those rights. But of course, they're doing it because we say it's okay. But that's the opinion of the large majority of Americans. And the same large majority, this runs around 75%, says that a nuclear weapons-free zone should be established in the region, including Iran, Israel, American forces deployed there, and so on. Well, that would end the crisis. Is that possible? Well, it's supported by the large majority of Americans, but as I mentioned, they're not part of the world. It's Iran's official policy, but they're not part of the world. The U.S. and Britain are formally committed to it, in fact, more so than any other powers, for a very simple reason, which we would read about if we had a free press. When the United States and Britain went to war with Iraq and tried to find a thin legal cover for it, they appealed to UN Security Council Resolution 687, 1991, which ordered Iraq to get rid of its weapons of mass destruction. And as you remember, Britain and the United States claimed they hadn't lived up to it. Well, you know, you're all literate. You can read Resolution 687. It commits the United States and Britain to work to establish a nuclear-free weapon zone in the Middle East. Okay, so if you can appeal to it as a justification for aggression, you're compelled to follow its provisions. But to point that out would be really to break the rules. And you can, again, do a Google search and see if you can find anyone near the mainstream who's ever bothered to point this out. Another way to move towards a solution would be to end the threats against Iran. The threats, if anyone cares, are a violation of the UN Charter, but for outlaw states, that's irrelevant. Again, the large majority of the American population thinks we should end the threats and move to normal diplomatic relations with Iran. Well, if these steps were taken, the crisis would essentially be over. So we can ask, who's defying the world? If the world includes its people, you know, including the American people. And the answer is very simple and straightforward. Those who are defying the world are the ones in power in Washington and in London and in the editorial offices and the university faculties and so on. They're defying the world, but not Iran, not on these issues. And in fact, it's a serious matter because it could lead to total disaster. And the same is true on other issues. So the other major live issue in the Middle East is Israel-Palestine. Well, what does the world think about this? There is an international consensus supported by about 2/3 of the American population, supported by former non-aligned countries, supported by the Arab world, formally at least supported by Europe, obviously Latin America. In fact, everyone. Iran supports it, Hamas supports it. It's for a two-state settlement on the international borders with, meaning pre-June 67 borders with minor modifications. Who opposes that? Well, for the last 30 years, the United States has opposed it, and it continues to oppose it. And Israel, of course, opposes it, though if the U.S. would support it, Israel would necessarily go along. So the problem is right in Washington. This begins in 1976, when the U.S. vetoed the first Security Council resolution calling for a settlement in these terms. It was introduced by the Arab states, backed by the PLO. Actually, it even goes back earlier to 1971, when President Sadat of Egypt offered Israel a full peace treaty in return for withdrawal from occupied territories. What he cared about was withdrawal from the Sinai, where Israel was kicking out thousands of peasants and settling. Israel, he didn't say anything about the Palestinians. They were not an issue at the time. Israel recognized it as a genuine peace offer and decided to reject it. They made a fateful decision, preferring expansion to security. Peace treaty with Israel would have ended security problems. Egypt would have ended security problems. The important question is what would happen in the United States? You know, the Godfather. Well, Kissinger managed, there was a battle, a bureaucratic internal battle in the United States. Kissinger won, and the U.S. followed his policy, which he called stalemate, meaning no negotiations, just force. Okay? That set the stage for the 1973 war and on to a whole list of horrors since. And up till today, the United States and Israel have been leading the rejectionist camp. By now, they are the rejectionist camp, not the U.S. population, but the government. So who's defying the world on this issue? Is there a possible settlement? Sure there is, but it resides here. In fact, on issue after issue, the major problems happen to be right here, which is a very optimistic conclusion because it means that we can do something about it. It's here that we can have an influence, not elsewhere. I'll stop. Some time? Yeah.
If anyone has any questions, there's mics set up. 3 mics. You can come on down.
Contrary to what was said here in the introduction, the New York Times, of course, did not say that you were the most important intellectual alive, and you know that well. It was merely an outsider, a professor at Stanford, who said it in a review which appeared in the New York Times. Interestingly enough, you've used that quote on several of your books, also a fabricated quote. You've also said that whenever that arises during an introduction like tonight, you always say something about it and correct it. And that's, of course, a falsehood because you didn't do it here tonight. And that's happened in the past also. Number 2, I couldn't help but notice the reference to Arthur Schlesinger. Apparently, you still something sticking in your craw about your bout with him, I guess it was around 1970, in which he exposed you for fabricating some Harry Truman quotes. That was the exchange in which he dubbed you an intellectual crook. So I guess that's still sticking in your craw even now. And finally, as to this notion of cheering for the home team, which obviously you don't do, there's somebody else you're cheering for. So I'd like you to be very forthright, like some leftists do, who say they are cheering for our opponents in various places around the world, quite clearly. Do you have the courage to tell us right now that you are pulling against us in Iraq and Afghanistan, that you're hoping we fail, that you support the terrorists, or you might call them freedom fighters, hoping they kill Americans?
We get the point, yeah. Can I go through these points? On the first one, the quote, it was not by somebody interviewed, it was by a reviewer in the New York Times.
He was interviewed.
He wasn't, you said he was interviewed.
I did not say that. Listen up.
You did, but it doesn't matter.
It was a book review.
It was a book review, right. And it's true that I didn't bother to correct it tonight, but I almost always do it because it's funny. It's a very funny thing. What he actually said is, he's the most important intellectual in the world. How can you write such terrible things about U.S. foreign policy? I like that quote. So I invariably correct it. You say you see it on the backs of books. If you take a look at the publishing industry, you'll find that the author has absolutely no control over what appears in blurbs. Nothing. If I had a choice, I'd tell them not to use it, of course, and I often do. But they like to use it, and then I correct it when it's brought up. That's because I think the actual quote is quite interesting. So that's one. As for Schlesinger, you've got the story backwards. I criticized Schlesinger on these points in a book that appeared in 1969, which he was furious about. And in his review of that book, which was a furious review, he tried to find some error, and he found an absolutely trivial error, so small that it was corrected 2 months later in the second printing. But he's been screaming about it. He's screamed about it ever since, and people like you do too. The error was that in quoting a speech by Harry Truman, okay, instead of quoting his actual speech, I quoted a virtually verbatim paraphrase of it by a leading respected commentator, James Warburg, So the words were slightly different, though the content was exactly the same. As I say, it was so trivial, it was corrected 2 months later in the second printing. It's a rare book that doesn't have some small error. But yes, you know, the defenders of state violence are desperate, and if they can find anything that they can point to, they'll run with it forever. So that's the truth about the second point. As for the cheering, you heard what I said, and it's what I've written. I think we should pay attention to the population, okay? Population of the United States, population of Iraq, population of the world. We should pay attention to what they think. Of course, those who are, you know, supporters of state violence think we shouldn't. We should pay attention to the guys in power and to the sort of cheering section that among the intellectuals that supports them. Well, I don't agree with that. Just to take the case of Iran, I think the opinion of the American population happens to be very sound, and I support it. And the same is true in Iraq. I think the opinion of Iraqis is very sane. Last December, the Pentagon released a study of focus groups in Iraq and reported it as good news. They gave a very upbeat report. They said, contrary to what people are saying, you know, the critics, there's a lot of agreement among Iraqis, and therefore there's hope for reconciliation, okay? And then if you read down a little further, what was their agreement about? Well, there was overwhelming agreement among Iraqis that the United States is responsible for the ethnic cleansing and the sectarian violence, and that the United States should get out, okay? That's what there's agreement about. Well, yeah, I think we should pay attention to our victims. And I can go down the line if you like. Everything else you said is just pure fabrication, and you know it. If you want to write me an email about it, I'll be glad to give you, you know.
You haven't got the courage to tell who you're cheerleading for.
Pardon?
You haven't got the courage to tell us who you're cheerleading for.
You've made your point. Let's go.
Decades ago, the U.S. instituted a policy of undercutting foreign food markets.
I'm sorry. Could you raise your hand, whoever's talking? Oh, over there. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Go ahead.
Decades ago, the U.S. instituted a policy of undercutting foreign food markets via U.S. subsidies. Recently, U.S. farm subsidies have shifted to ethanol markets, much to the chagrin of almost every third world nation, and furthermore, much to the disinterest of almost every major media network. What role, if any, do you think this food crisis will play in U.S. expansionist policies?
Well, just to clarify a little bit, when the ethanol craze began, it was overwhelmingly cheered by the media and commentators and so on. Not by everyone. I mean, I wrote an article criticizing it. In fact, there was even an article in Foreign Affairs criticizing it. So there were critics. But it didn't take much thought to realize that shifting of cropland to ethanol production, to fuel, was going to cause an increase in prices of food and a shortage of food. I mean, you know, it doesn't have to be a genius to figure that out. It's particularly true when it's U.S. ethanol. It wouldn't have been so obvious, and maybe wouldn't have even been true if it was Brazilian ethanol. Brazilian ethanol is made from sugar. It's much more efficient and it's much cheaper. And in order to keep the ethanol industry functioning here, the government has to, first of all, provide huge subsidies to agribusiness, and also to impose a huge tariff to prevent much cheaper and more efficient Brazilian ethanol from getting into the country. The technical term for that is free trade. Okay, but if it's it's a big gift to agribusiness. It takes plenty of land away from crop production. That means that there's a shortage of corn, but also of a lot of other things. You know, if land is shifted to corn production, inefficient corn production for ethanol, it's not being used for soybeans and peas and so on. So that gets reduced. Same happening in the third world. Third world countries that are, say, producing soybeans may shift to using to crops that will be bought up by the rich for ethanol. And that's happening too. So it spirals, and yes, it's one of the factors leading to a very serious food crisis. Just how much of a factor that is pretty hard to estimate. So the drought in Australia is also a big contributory factor. But all of that's kind of irrelevant. We can't do anything about the drought in Australia. The one factor we can do something about is the use of cropland for fuel. And ethanol is not particularly efficient from the point of view of pollution or energy inputs and so on and so forth. So all across the board, it was, I think, a disaster, and it was understood to be, anyone who thought about it from the beginning, and it ought to be terminated. If anybody wants to use ethanol, they should break down the protectionist barriers and the subsidies to agribusiness and use Brazilian ethanol. It's causing, all of this is part of a whole system of undermining third world farmers. So one of the big effects of NAFTA intended effects is to drive Mexican peasants off the land. Mexican peasants cannot compete with highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness. It's kind of obvious. So slowly being driven off the land, it's going to get worse now that Mexico's been forced to eliminate all tariffs. And they flood into the cities, they lower wages, which is very good for U.S. manufacturers who are exporting production there. And then they try to flee across the border. So we build walls. I mean, these things are all interconnected. Same with Haiti. I mean, when one of the things that American cheerleaders are supposed to cheer the government about is that Clinton sent the Marines to put an end to terror in Haiti in 1995. That part is true, but there's a little more. The elected government, the Aristide government, first elected government in Haiti, was a populist independent government led by what we call a radical priest, meaning liberation theologist concerned about the poor. It was overthrown a couple of months later by a military coup, as anticipated. The U.S. had done everything possible to try to undercut it in those few months. The U.S. immediately turned to supporting the military coup, violating the Organization of American States embargo. That was under Bush 1. Under Clinton, the violations increased. Clinton actually authorized the Texaco Oil Company to send oil to the military junta and the rich elite in violation of his own presidential order. In 1995, Clinton decided that the population had been tortured enough, and it was pretty miserable. I was there for a while. So he figured that's enough. We'll let the elected government go back, but on a condition. The condition was that they accept a very harsh neoliberal regime. I mean, drop all your tariffs, drop all support for local production, and so on. Well, the outcome was completely predictable. I'm not saying it in retrospect. I and others wrote about it at the time. Haitian rice farmers are pretty efficient, but they cannot compete with highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness exporters. So now Haiti's short of food, and you're getting food riots. Yeah, predictably. That's the consequence of following such policies. And again, it doesn't take genius to figure them out. It's kind of like an elementary school student can figure it out. And this is happening in many places. So your point is very significant. There is a major food crisis, and we're not helping.
Hi. First of all, thanks. I want to thank you a lot for all the intellectual inspiration. All these matters are a lot more interesting now that they make sense. And I've been following the news a lot lately with Iraq, and it seems like there's some deal of escalation going on in Iraq. And like a few weeks ago, Vice President Cheney made a major trip to the Middle East, and shortly thereafter, the Iraqi government commenced a large-scale offensive against Sadr's forces in Basra, and subsequently there was more large-scale action against Sadr's forces in Sadr City in Baghdad. And there was an interesting phrase that was used in an article I saw. There are Iraqi tanks attacking Sadr City.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last.
It was interesting that they used the phrase Iraqi tanks, which are storming Sadr City. But I was thinking about this, and it seems like our policy on the war in Iraq has been almost remarkably restrained. It seems like we've been concentrating mostly on like the green zone and the oil infrastructure. And so given these recent escalations, I was wondering if you thought perhaps we're going to attempt to ferment some kind of like increased violence and bloodbath, and perhaps use that as a pretext for additional action in Iran. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on this.
Well, you're right that the war in Iraq is restrained by comparative standards. Killed 100,000 people, maybe over 1 million, may have destroyed the country forever. It's worse than the Mongol invasions and so on. Yeah, but that's restrained. For example, it's nothing like the attack on Vietnam. I'm not even close. The Iraq War has never reached the scale of Vietnam in about 1965. You know, at that time there was no protest. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One reason is that the American population is much more strongly opposed to aggression than it was in the 1960s. That's part of the civilizing effect of the activism of the 60s. It had a big effect on the population, on all kind of things. Support for civil rights, for women's rights, the environmental movement, you know, all the kinds of things I was quoting about the American Indians. Those were standard attitudes in the 60s, not even questioned. The kind of things that kids were reading in school texts, say my own children in the late 60s, you couldn't find in the most backward, crazed part of the country today. It wouldn't be permissible. All of this is a civilizing effect. That's why the 60s are constantly condemned as the time of troubles, you know, kids going crazy and so on. They committed a crime. They civilized the country. And one of the forms of civilization was opposition to aggression. So contrary to what is commonly said, protest against the Iraq War is far beyond protest against the Vietnam War at any comparable stage. At this stage of the Vietnam War, there was no talk about withdrawal. In fact, the first book on withdrawal was written by Howard Zinn, who you know, and it was, I think, 1967. That's a time when there was, you know, 500,000 American troops there. The countries had been torn to shreds, extended to the, and that could barely be mentioned because it was so far out. Actually, he asked me to write a review of it, which I did in Ramparts, because nobody would mention it. Well, now, at a much lower stage of aggression in Iraq, everyone has to say something about withdrawal. Maybe they don't mean it, but they have to say something, you know. That's a big change. So one reason why it's restrained by comparative standards is there's just way more opposition. I mean, after all, the Iraq War is the first war in the history of Western imperialism that was massively protested before it was officially inaugurated. And that's never happened before, not that I can think of. So that's one factor. But there's another more important factor. Vietnam didn't matter much to the United States. I mean, if the country was wiped off the map, the U.S. didn't care. I mean, Eisenhower tried to build up some support for his early stage of the war by talking about tin and rubber and so on, but that was a joke. I mean, Vietnam had no resources of significance to the United States. The concern about Vietnam was what I mentioned, the virus infection theory. There was deep concern that successful independent development in Vietnam might spur others to take on the same efforts. The rot might spread to Thailand, maybe to Indonesia, maybe even to Japan, which was called the super domino by John Dower, a leading Japan historian. Japan might have to accommodate to an independent Southeast Asia. That would have meant the United States had lost the Pacific War, which they weren't prepared to do in 1950. So there was a concern about Vietnam, but it had nothing to do with its resources. And in fact, the concern was overcome just by wiping the place out. So the U.S. basically won the war in the 1970s. Didn't achieve its maximal objectives, but it did satisfy its basic war aims. You can't destroy Iraq. It's far too valuable. I mean, Iraq has probably the second largest energy resources in the world. They're very cheap and easily available. It's not like Alberta tar sands. You stick a pipe in the sand and, you know, the oil gushes out. And it's right at the heart of the major energy producing section of the world. That's a valuable asset, not like Vietnam. So yes, there's got to be a limit on the destructiveness. You can't destroy an asset that you want to maintain. And the U.S. does want to maintain it. Today it happens that I just took a look at the morning newspaper. Christian Science Monitor has a front page article on the opening of what's called the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. I mean, the embassy is not like any embassy in the world. It's the size of the Vatican. has 21 buildings. It's an entirely self-contained city inside